Welcome, Simon Mont and Tracy Kunkler. Tracy is my partner in Circle Forward, and this is Michelle Smith with Circle Forward. And we're here with Simon Mont, who we first discovered through some work he did through the Sustainable Economies Law Center and an article that appeared in Nonprofit Quarterly that really we really responded to as and we resonated with. There were some pieces of that we were experiencing as well, and really appreciated Simon's articulation of that experience around organizations using holacracy and sociocracy specifically. And Tracy and our work with Circle Forward definitely has some strong roots in sociocracy. Our mentor and even our a quiet partner in Circle Forward is John Buck, who brought sociocracy to the English-speaking world, and who we feel a great attachment to and huge respect. And
actually taught Brian Robertson. I think he also was the one that introduced it to Brian Robertson, and then Indeed. Brian evolved this holacracy out of that. So it's a shared lineage there.
Right. And in our work and our experience, Tracy's work in particular, working in networks of organizations, multi-state, multi-organizational, multi-sector networks, and then also, again, working with communities when they're marginalized or anything that's kind of not a business, a corporate business, which we haven't worked with that many of them, but some of them more purpose-based businesses. There are just things about the sort of structure of sociocracy, holacracy, and sort of the bringing that whole package, like, boom, here's governance in a box, to your organization, that, like, we just met resistance. There were places that were that it just didn't seem to be working, and so we were tickled to read that article and wanted to talk with you. And Tracy, do you have anything you want to add to that right now?
I'd like to hear where did that article come from? I'm curious.
So I started a couple years ago working with both the Law Center. The Law Center did kind of work on what they called worker self-directed nonprofits, which is effectively kind of another angle on this same fire of holacracy, sociocracy, reinventing organizations, dynamic governance, like same. But they initially came to that whole conceptual space through more of a particular anti-oppressive lens, and they kind of stumbled and then ended up finding these resources from that. So they kind of approached it in a different way. And then also we're particularly interested in the nonprofit sector as a sector, and seeing the kind of structural problems and structural and systemic issues that were a part of existence in that sector as it related to people who wanted to do deep systemic change work. And the little tagline there is nonprofit industrial complex issues. Mm-hmm. So I came and started doing legal research around it. That's my background, lawyer, to see kind of what the bounds were. There's this really interesting thing, especially in the nonprofit space, of folks thinking, oh, there's a certain thing that my board of directors has to do. There's all this best practices around what a board of directors has to do. So we kind of had to get in there and figure out, well, exactly what do we have to do, and what's just kind of an entrenched pattern that we can recreate. So it started there. And then we just started talking. We did interviews with a bunch of organizations that had kind of done things like this before. Again, most of them had while the Law Center kind of engaged with sociocracy, read holacracy, read Reinventing Organizations as part of their journey to create what we call the Selfocracy, which is our little individual governance system.
What is it? The Selfocracy?
Selk. Sustainable Economies Law Center.
Oh, got it.
Acronym.
Got it.
Most of the organizations that we talked to actually didn't have as much familiarity with these tools that were coming out of other spaces. I mean, particularly kind of more for-profit spaces. There's like a lot of much more creative management stuff coming out of for-profit spaces than movement and nonprofit spaces. So we started doing that. We started talking to folks, and then that particular article grew out of really two relationships that I had with two different organizations. One whose story I just heard, like most of that story was based off a particular, like one organization that they were curious about our experience. So we just talked about it. And then it was also, fairly heavily informed with another organization that I did kind of deeper consulting work with, where I got to really get in there and see how stuff was moving. And again, I think the drive to write into that space is really this observation that like there's really incredible developments in like collective management happening in some spaces, and there's like this whole self integral theory, really rich space. And then there's like the anti-oppression, interpersonal anti-oppression. And then there's like the big systemic change, like with an eye toward justice. And all of these conversations feel separate to me. It feels like they're happening in separate communities, but to me, it feels like exactly this. It's just the same, different angles on the same conversation.
It's like you're naming the integral quadrants, right? And they're operating. Yeah.
So as part of my kind of where I see myself trying to figure out how to serve this kind of broader community is figuring out how we're going to start tying those things together. So folks can learn how to talk to each other about it and realize that we all have like this indispensable information. And it's kind of silly that we are sitting apart from each other, often triggering each other.
Yeah. And it's like, I think the real change is going to come. The real change is it's an inner and an outer, it's an internal and an external. It's an individual and it's a community and it's a collective, and it's happening at all of these different levels at the same time. And actually they all play into each other because, if you're in a systems change space, I experience myself and I see other people experiencing the kind of inner work that we need to do in order to participate, even at this high level change space. It requires learning new things and being very humble about what we don't know, and cultivating new skills and awarenesses and stuff. So I love the way you're framing this, Simon. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Tracy and I both, come from some degree or another out of different directions, but out of nonprofit work, pretty much, and justice work and social change work of some kind. And, I had been really burned out on working in nonprofits, and social change in general. I just kind of was like done. Watching the organizations that were set up to make change, to make the world better, internally just be as dysfunctional as, as outwardly.
Right.
And so then when I found, and it was sociocracy, and when I went to a training, I went to John Buck and Tracy was a little bit ahead of me on it. When I went into there and I experienced decision-making by consent, and I saw like double linking and how what that was supposed to achieve, and how that could, the idea of no voice goes unheard, and then real transparency and accountability and all the values and principles. It was like, this is what we've been needing. This is what we kept thinking it was personal, personality things. And are we just going to have to get everybody healed up before we can move forward and get these things changed? But then, after working with it for a while and doing, bringing it to groups in different ways and doing sort of change work with groups in different ways, it was just, it was clear that there was even more, and that it wasn't, I can definitely, relate to something in your article where you think people just aren't doing it right, or they're just not committed to doing it, but it's like, nope, that's maybe so, but that's not fixing it. Like that doesn't, that's changes anything.
Yeah.
Like maybe if we could all do it right, but there's something further back. And Tracy really identified just that principle of consent is,
I think we came to that really at some point. We said that's really our legacy from Sociocracy, was that principle of consent, and that's what so Circle Forward started as another alternative on kind of Sociocracy, dynamic governance. It was another kind of branch of that same governance system, and we've really revamped and rethought it a lot. And it's been in relationship with clients and people trying it and really looking for knowing there must be a better way. They don't want to continue to do this top-down structure. It's not working. They see they're missing, they're not tapping the creativity and the wisdom of the people around them in the way that they want to be. And even if they're have that inclination, the best they can come up with is a benign dictator, like as the form, to be an executive director in a nonprofit is just, to me, it's a ridiculous role in so many ways. You're like the pinch point in this whole system of relationships of staff and board and community and stakeholders. I mean, it's just people talk about, well, if nonprofits could work more like businesses, and I would love it if businesses could work more like nonprofits. Honestly, I wish that businesses could hold the complexity of multiple relationships, multiple bottom lines. Business hasn't been held to multiple bottom lines, and so I'd love to see them try to hold a social impact at the same time that they're trying to hold a financial bottom line, at the same time that their customer and who's paying them, which is a donor foundation, is not actually who's receiving the services, but it's actually somebody else that receives the services, and the money for them come in from, and they have a different set of needs and desires to be met. It's just an incredibly complex space. So I don't know why I'm going off on that, except to say that when you're in governance and when you're thinking about how to make all that work, I think there are a lot of folks that have the value set, but they just didn't know how to make it happen. And so we continue to see that, and we're getting much better at working in those spaces now with those folks, with those leaders, recognizing there isn't this one size model. There's no model that you're going to come and you're going to, just put into place. And we learned that really the hard way. Like Michelle was saying, we learned that by, a lot of people just giving us feedback about what they didn't like, and some honestly, some grief, and I had to let go of that. There is this there is this answer. And what we've come more to now is that people are the architects of their own governance, and that they're attempting to create a value system. And that for us, what we've really landed on is this principle of consent, that how do you create structures that, just like you hear consent everywhere else, like sexually, you can't be coerced into doing things that you don't think are right or that you don't want to do. Your doctor can't just operate on you. Informed consent is a principle that people are familiar with, and we're trying to help people be more familiar with, there's this idea of the consent of the governed, and it doesn't mean, compliance. That's not consent. And that when you're in these workspaces, that you're, the feedback that you have and your intelligence is important to the whole system. And so your compliance is, it's not what we would be seeking in a culture of consent. So we're looking, there's lots of structures to get to that culture of consent. And we've just been diving in and trying to learn like all the different ways that, all the different practices, all the different facilitation practices, liberating structures. Have you heard of liberating structures?
A little bit. They're good?
God, it's amazing. So you just go on their website and they have 33 process tools that anybody can pick up and use in groups to unleash and change the culture. They call them the microstructures of your culture, the microstructures of how you're making decisions together. So there's just so many different tools. We're like, wow, so sociocracy sort of launched us into this container of governance, that governance is governance is power. That's, if you're talking about power relationships and power structures, you're talking about governance. You're talking about how people are making decisions, how resources are getting allocated, what those structures and systems are. And I've just been committed and realized like governance is a huge leverage point in this whole culture right now, that we have so much technology, but what we don't have is the diversity of voices participating in decision making. We have too many people that are marginalized and disempowered right now. We're not really unleashing the full potential, and that's the problem in our governance. So we are just looking at this from the very local to the very, really kind of large scale, and just, it's a fractal thing. And again, all these contexts are very different, and the people in that context, if we're really self-governing, then we are the architects of that governance system, right? If we're really self-governing, then we are doing this. And yeah, that's a lot, but that's kind of a sort of the past 5 years in 5 minutes or 10 minutes.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I think that's exactly where I come in on it too. It's like, to me, like the idea, like the very idea that there's one particular model that we can apply to all of these different situations, that's still like the colonized industrial framework. It's not the notion that like, even though there are certain principles that are alive in every ecosystem, each one is its own thing, and that there's like this emergent quality to it. And that I think like the aspect, to me, like having the power to create your governance structure, to me, like almost is the liberation, right? It is, because that's the moment where we look at each other and we say, look, we could invent whatever world we want to live in together, starting from nothing. How are we going to do this together? And there are no big tools or structures. So it actually has to start from like internal. What do I want? Who are you? Oh, so it starts from a more kind of heartfelt space. And then I see our, like the roles that we type of play is like, hey, I'm going to help you skip the first 20 mistakes that you would probably make.
Right.
So we can hop to mistake 21. And you make mistake 21. And then next time when I talk to somebody else, we'll be able to skip the first 21 mistakes.
I love it. That's beautiful.
I like the way you say that. Yeah.
Tracy and I are both permaculture enthusiasts.
Oh.
Yeah.
I know when I first saw like sociocracy, I was like, oh, it's a lot like permaculture for groups,
The edge of like, how do we get folks to engage and energize it? That's really where we're at right now. Really, we have like, we know these 18 organizations, we know that not only do they have incredible things to offer each other, but that they literally are always asking, like, I just kind of want to connect with my peers. So we're like, okay, here are each other's email addresses. Here's your phone numbers. Here's a Slack channel. Here's a Drive. But in a world where everyone's busy.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And that's really, in a world where everyone's busy, how do we create this thing? And that's where the idea of trying to get this little stewardship committee is. And I think what we're leaning toward is really just trying to first understand, just really understand how to get this size of a group to congeal and support each other, and then and develop the intimacy of being able to say, to be able to ask for that help that sometimes we really need, which is hey, I know that this structure is coming, but I'm an executive director and I want to move to a participatory budgeting structure, but honestly, I'm just scared that my staff doesn't have the capacity. So I'm holding on to my power instead of releasing it. And I need help understanding what's reasonable fear and what's attachment to role. It's because that's where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, that's it. Because I think a lot about that, the difference between power and control. And it's letting go of control doesn't mean you're letting go of power, right, to influence. And it's not just going to go into chaos when you let go of, it might go into some chaos when you let go of control, but out of that chaos comes the self-organizing. And so that is a big edge. And I think that one is just, I think every executive director, that's a really rich issue we've run into too. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or business owner or general manager, that.
Yeah.
And being able to build that into your measurables and your deliverables, we're going to have some chaos. Board of directors, this is where we're expecting the chaos to happen. We need some time for that. We're going to need to make time for that. Just being able to let people know that we can't pack this way.
Yeah.
Corner to corner, because there's going to be this, if we're going to make a change.
Yeah, it's the whole culture. It's what you're talking about. It's a culture. It is a mindset shift, and even just creating a network and a space that people are asking for, because people, I think you're totally right. We want those peer spaces, but then how often do we make that our first priority?
Yeah, and I think we all want self-care and self-love, but how often are we prioritizing that for ourselves too? It's there's a whole deep mindset that we're entrenched in, that's myself included, that is
totally
makes it really,
what
really
is work, what is work, and what is
yeah, some of the I think some of the really richest moments I've seen in terms of opening that up is our very gendered way of viewing what real work is, and noticing there's actually some people who are starting to pay people for providing emotional labor to one another. So they're hiring people that are just to help people process stuff, and really paying, getting finely attuned to the fact they're that paying attention to deliverables, work, writing, all of those things is reproducing the same system that they're trying to break out of. So I think I think that's one of the, to me, one of the more juicy entry points in, because it can be really hard to talk about our heart or our whole being in a professionalized space, but in those justice spaces, if you can come in on the angle of gender, then people kind of understand how what's going on, and oh, you're right, and then we can flip into we're just kind of missing the point of life here.
Yeah. We're very efficiently destroying and unraveling our whole ecosystem. Yeah.
And
We've got efficiency.
And our families and our relationships and our
our communities.
Yeah, we like, I have done this. Oh man, I have been like a champion at like applying the like overwork myself, deny myself, like capitalist, I am a worker mindset into social change, and then watching all of my relationships deteriorate and become like a shell of myself. It's like, and we're doing it. We're doing it. We've instituted the role of executive director, literally institutionalized. It's
right.
That's like, doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
The end of rant.
Yes. Well, and if you look at statistically, they don't stay in that role. Like executive directors are turning over. No, they're like,
be an executive director again.
They're leaving the field too. They're not only just like, turning over in these roles, but they're like leaving the nonprofit field a lot of times.
That was the first thing I wrote for Nonprofit Quarterly was the point of like, because I think it's important for us to figure out how we're going to, like, we want to shift entire systems. So part of what that is supporting people who observe the need for the shift. And part of that is like attuning people to the very need for the fundamental shift. So I think the executive director is like a nice, like acupressure point for that, because it's like, the whole nonprofit world knows there's a problem with executive directors. So a lot of the solutions are like, how are we going to train the next generation? How are we going to pay them more? So just be like, the first article I wrote was like, don't do that. Just like change the whole thing. Just get rid of the role.
That's right.
Just get rid of the role and do something.
What is it like? Deconstruct the role,
That's one of the things that we do. One of my favorite things that we do at our trainings is I'll give people an executive director role, and I'll use that to help them show, like, and the exercise is, how do you break this off into smaller manageable roles and distribute that throughout a system, so everybody, and it helps executive directors see like, oh, all of these responsibilities that I was going to do, they're still getting done. They're just held by a system as opposed to like a singular human system. They're held by
that
group of humans.
It's so important what you're saying, Simon. That is great. That's going to be one of our clips, because there's a lot of people that are going to appreciate hearing you say that and that approach. I love it.
Yeah. It's also, and there's people, what's it called? Pangea Legal has this great model where they have a huge spreadsheet, and they've got all of every task, every like micro level task that has to get done to keep the organization running. And they've got them color coded into types, like legal work or administrative work. And then the other axis is like every person in the organization. So they have this like deep tracking of who's doing what and what types of things they're doing. So then later, and I think it's like once a year, they all just come to the table and say, all right, let's redo it.
Wow.
Let's shift the whole thing. But I think, like, to me, it's that level of clarity that's required to help people understand that it's being held and whose terrain is whose terrain. And so when our like fearful, oh my gosh, I hope this ball doesn't get dropped, self comes in, we don't end up, because a lot of times it's like that happens. And then we like try to control, and we congeal power around us, and we disturb all the things. And that's kind of a bummer.
There is a person, if you are looking for people who can talk about this, there's a woman who lives locally here who is an executive director of a small independent school. And she was one of the first folks in our region to start using sociocracy. And so Rainbow Community School has turned it into their own system. But she could really speak to that shift herself of realizing just what you described, and in a different way, in her own way, but becoming that kind of empowering director, and using a circle structure, in her case, using a circle structure so that people, a team-based kind of structure so that people can take on, and knowing where is she delegate, where is she letting go? Like, well, who's got this? And really setting up the organization, kind of like what you just said with these buckets, the way you've got yours, these like functional areas and the people who need to be there in that circle. But she's just, to me, is like a paragon of that kind of empowering, delegating, leadership role. And so I don't know how you, again, like the network, you don't know yet how it's going to grow and develop, but we're thinking about how we can do similar, like how can we put out material, even just this call, right? So how can we put out things like this that people can digest, have a panel of executive directors, have some people who can, for us too, the other one that I'm realizing I'm getting some, a group of folks who get the all volunteer organization, and that challenge of the all volunteer organization, and how you kind of navigate that space well and distribute leadership and distribute power in that space, because you will end up in the all volunteer organization, right, with like the same 5 people who are doing everything. It's kind of its own, and that dynamic, and and I can imagine, some executive directors. I mean, I think it would be really fascinating to put together a program like this, like the directors who are doing that really well, like you just described that spreadsheet. That's amazing.
Yeah, I know it is. It's definitely alive for me. Like how to start the conversation, and how to start to bring the conversation to a broader and more mainstream audience. And then also, I think how to do that so that all of the folks who are doing this kind of work are all seen as like a coherent movement, because I think that what's happening is, right, all of us, in order, and I'm really struggling with this myself, all of us, in order to like raise up a flag and attract people, potential clients and people to work with, we all are creating a brand that like aligns us with some things and differentiates us with stuff. And then there's also like, we're embedded in a scarcity mentality by virtue of the way our society is structured. So you have people congealing brands and intellectual property around things, and then saying, I'm not this. And I did some of that in the way I wrote, right? So like, how do we name that, like, actually it's all the same, kind of, enough, like there's a thing happening. And I think that reinventing organizations did that to a certain extent, but because of the way its focus was, it didn't include a lot of the types of power that are not formal power, right? Like more the kind of oppression and kind of historically driven currents. It didn't cast it wide enough to get everybody going. So I wonder how we're going to do that. I have dreams of like a network of people who are all doing this kind of work. There's tons of people doing this, tons of people. But how are we going to start to see each other and support each other and build out something? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, we've been doing this for a few years, probably a lot of years now, with some of the sociocracy, holacracy community of consultants. And so we formed, and it's continuing, a peer network called the Healthy Power Alliance. And it's a space for us to create our own learning together. So yeah, we're ostensibly people who would be competing with each other, but we're really not, because we're living in very different areas. And so we have folks that are part of the network in Europe and Canada and the United States and on the Pacific Coast and on the East Coast. And so we really don't compete, and that's helpful, but just, you know, a space where we can continue to, I mean, that's what we went into it with, is a space that we can continue to develop our, kind of what you're saying, like we can have that peer space where we can, wow, have you tried this? Have you tried, like, even just going more deeply into, well, how did you set up that network? And I mean, I'm super curious, and I could share with you some of the tools that I've been finding helpful and working with clients. And so that's one thing, is that's one space that has sort of been opened up. And then there are the spaces for the practitioners. So there's those of us that are supporting practitioners, and then there are the people that are doing that work. And then I want to say something that I've been involved in, and I'm working with a team now sort of launching, and we're actually launching, if you have March 15th from 3 to 4, we've been going through a visioning and a theory of change process, and we're about ready to kind of share the narrative and see if people want to get involved. And we're kind of thinking through how to open up this network, but we're calling ourselves the Emerging Network Governance Initiative. And it's looking at what you're seeing is that we're in this transition, right? So our old governance, societal governance system, our government, right, is off the chain. Like, it's not working for most of us. And, you know, money and power, or concentrated power, are corrupting, you know, a lot of our governments, especially at the state and federal level. And, you know, and we're not addressing life-threatening conditions, you know, on so many levels. Our governance system isn't addressing most of the systemic issues that we have. And so, but what's happening is that people are self-organizing, and they are addressing things in systemic ways, in networks, you know, and they are bringing together they are talking about equity. They are talking about, you know, who's been marginalized, and trying to have the diversity of the systems that they're trying to change. They're trying to replicate that diversity in their structure for how they're going to address the change. And they're thinking holistically and systemically. So, for example, the food system, everybody's aware we have a local food movement, right? And the local food movement is a completely self-organized, grassroots-driven, you know, the local food movement, which, you know, continues to question itself about its equity and how inclusive it is, and lots of things. But it's like the massive, massive web network of food councils and networks across North America, and there are networks of networks in the food system change world, and there's a lot of dimensions of it, and it intersects with health, and it intersects with justice and food sovereignty and lots of other issues. And so what we're saying is, you know, why, when we have such a sophisticated, incredibly networked system of food systems change, why are they not addressing food policy? And they're not just coming from the left. You know, it's crossing partisan lines. You know, these food councils touch everybody in communities, and they're bringing together governments involved in food council work, and, you know, government, universities, nonprofits, grassroots, faith communities, school systems, hospitals, institutions. I mean, it's touching a lot of different organizations and kind of string. So why are they, like, you know, the question is, why are they not making food policy for this country? Because they are deeply, so what happens is you have these food councils or food policy councils, and they're strategizing, like, how do we get our elected representatives to understand these issues and why they're important? And so it's just, you know, and so it's kind of I think we're in this transition now where these spaces are becoming, this is where the flame of democracy is now, right? This is where people are, they're having the deep deliberative conversations that everybody's calling for around systemic issues, and they're building new structures and new systems that are more in alignment with people's values. And that's happening in food systems work, but it's happening across every sector: criminal justice and health and
aging,
the natural resources and aging and like economy. There's a whole new economy coalition that's nationwide. And so this emerging network governance initiative is saying, you know, it's just starting to imagine what would it be like. Maybe we're in a governance transition at the societal level, similar to when we transition from monarchy to representative democracy. Like there's this incredible paradigm shift that's happening, and that maybe we're in that kind of a shift right now. And where are we seeing that these structures are emerging? I mean, they are emerging, and there's a whole infrastructure. And so what this initiative is about is just helping people to be aware that this is happening. And because, you know, we get into our, you know, we get our siloed, you know, we get our work, we get our focus. And so what we're trying to do is say, you know, there's something, we have an enormous network of connection and relationship. We have incredible networks that run very broad and very deep. And like we have what we need to self-govern, and government is there too. So what is that space? What are those spaces that we can, and it's kind of the spiral dynamics of include and transcend. So it includes government, these spaces, but it transcends government. It's something new that's emerging, right? And how do we shepherd or midwife this new system into being? And in the goal of shifting power, in the same way that constitutional monarchies arose, you know, the monarchy we didn't tear it down. It just got absorbed into the next iteration of representative democracy. It has a place in that, but it's not, the power shifted, the power changed, right? As that transition happened. So that's kind of,
sign me up.
I want to introduce you to that, because I would really like to include what you're doing, because I think I would like to include you on, you know, we're like some of the next stages of this, because what you're building feels to me really important and very relevant, right, to this whole movement. Like, does that make sense? I mean, we're looking for folks like you right now tapping into this. Yeah,
and I think there's a lot resonates with me on like a lot of levels, and I think the overlap is really perfect, because what we're doing is saying that looking at the nonprofit sector, there's systemic power problems, and that we want to understand how to change the whole structure, and taking groups of small organizations as the intervention point to a system. And trying to figure out how we do that. So, and like, it'll be good. And I think the power of the small group is that it gives us those in our organizations. It gives us those smaller incubators to start stepping in to mindset shifts that will allow this other thing to come. Because right now, right, even like network governance, if we all are still stuck in the idea of governance being that like certain people have to be able to perceive the whole system and control the system, and there's got to be if we still think there's going to be like a single leader who's steering the ship, we'll never be able to get it. But we're all going to I'm going to still think that until enough lived experience of like, when there's no one steering the ship, we can do it. We can still do it. And until I get enough repatterning of my internal psyche to actually believe that I'm not going to do it. And until enough of us have enough experience, we're still not going to be able to do it. And as soon as we think, it's like our belief that we need the single leader is part of what enables the structure to emerge, that space to emerge where someone can fill it. If we all genuinely,
the belief that there's a role filled there.
Yeah. So
there's things that need to be done and ways for those things to communicate.
Yeah.
About each other and to a certain.
Yeah.
To a sufficient.
And for fun, I also think this is what's happening into like what we've been taught about our psyche and our self, right? The Western a Western concept of self is that there's a single driver here in my consciousness.
That's right. There's me.
There's this me. I think, therefore I am. Like, but not
there's
really.
A personal self.
There's like 15 me's living at different points in time that are all different, all arguing with each other. And like out of that somehow a vaguely coherent narrative emerges. But like once I get in touch with the multiplicity of my own self, then I'm like, oh, then I'm really can deeply connect into these things. And I think that level of like calling us all into that space is going to be part of where we need to go in order to break our consciousness open to be able to get there. So.
But
I love it.
It seems to me that being in the spaces is what helps us do that.
Yeah. Yeah. So how are we going to, being in spaces that help us see the new thing, and then also having those spaces start to spiral us inward to be able to see dimensions of our other dimensions of ourself that are usually excluded, that we usually just deny the reality of. Because then when we go in, then when it comes out from there, it's like a whole nother thing.
What? Say that again.
I guess.
Where did you just go?
There's a lot of different parts of myself that I can be in touch with, right? So I can be in touch with the part of myself that like really wants to make a good contribution, or the part of me that's kind of like scared and needs love. The part of me that is very much like an ancestral thread acting out a story that began thousands of years ago, and the part of me that was like trying to heal from the fact that I didn't get enough love as a kid. All these different parts that are coming. But most oftentimes in our organizational spaces, I actually act from one angle, which is the part of self that I've kind of been taught is like the best or conditioned to us to align myself with and identify and fixate on. And I'm because of the social circumstance I'm in, and I'm acting from that. So I'm always going to reproduce that pattern when I act from that. But if I can go inward farther and to see all of these other things, all these other selves that are having needs, then I can understand like where to act from in any given moment. And realize that maybe like, boy, I can snap into like a really fierce manager analytical thing. That's great sometimes. And sometimes like a heartfelt softness is really, but like the ability to take us all deeper in touch with those dynamics within ourselves, if we can hold that level of complexity and see ourselves as a complex ecosystem, each individual, then not only do we act from that place, but I'm constantly learning about network governance. My moment to moment, like if I can learn how to like manage the multiplicity within myself without needing to control or silence, boy, when I get into a room and I'm facilitating, it's a whole different experience, right? Then if I, so that's what I'm saying, like spiraling in.
I'm with you.
To get that reality out and have that just be a thing that we can talk about the same way we talk about oppression, the same way we talk about finances and budgets. We're talking about that, whatever.
That's the space. That is great. Oh, I would love to keep going. This is a good place for me to pause and press pause on this conversation, which I really hope continues. It's very satisfying to have conversation with somebody who's thinking about this stuff at the level that you are. So, yeah.
But yeah, I also am I really like cherish this ability to have this conversation. I'm really excited about the connection.
Yeah.
And like, there's definitely like, we're all looking at a thing.
Yeah. Well, some of our colleagues in England, I mean, you could say more about this, Michelle, because you were at the last meeting. So the Healthy Power Alliance wants to host some sort of convening this year to talk about power and to talk about democratic workspaces and power issues of power, just a lot of these same, like actually wants to host a space to talk about a lot of these issues. And I don't know if they're going to do it in Europe or if they're actually going to do it online and enable all of us to participate. They're kind of taking the lead on it, and sort of bringing together the academic community and the practitioner. So that's one of those other splits, is the theory and the practice. So they're academics who are really interested in bringing together theory and practice and people in this space, in this democratic workplace space, and just the space that we're talking about. So that's something I can, again, like come back and as that starts to develop more, or if you, want to participate in the development of that in some way as it starts to go, that's also possible.
Yeah. I'd love to be a part of these communities.
Cool.
Thank you so much, Simon, for making time.
Thank you all. Good to meet you in internet land.
We'll see you.
That's right. Nice. Have a good weekend.
You too. Bye.